Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Let's get our next guest on the show then. Coming up for 4 minutes past the hour. He's been speaking, chatting with me on my programs for many a year now. He's got a resume. It goes on as long as the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a terrific, he's a genius, I think. He's been at the forefront of critical thinking for many, many years. An academic, professor emeritus. He's written lots of fantastic, interesting, thought-provoking books about recent events, current events. Go to moonrockbooks.com, by the way, to find. I'll put out that email, that Twitter. I'll tweet out that link shortly. Last time he was on, we were talking about Donald Trump post the election in November. We'll talk a bit about Trump now, but other things as well. Let's welcome back to the show our friend Jim Fetzer. Jim, welcome back. How are you?
Oh, Richie, I'm absolutely delighted to be back, and there has been so much going on. It's been a veritable whirlwind since Trump's inauguration. In fact, he was making a difference even before he had formally become president.
You were excited about him leading up to the election, and you and I had a very frank and firm, but always friendly debate, you and I, about him and who he was and what he might do. Is it fair to say, based on a tweet you sent me last week, that you've maybe changed your mind, might be a bit, might be going a long stretch, but you certainly are thinking differently about Trump now in mid-February? What are you thinking, Jim?
Well, there's several aspects to this very complicated situation, Richie. For example, Trump has abandoned his two-China policy, which was causing a lot of upset in the foreign service. He has suggested that Netanyahu that building more of these settlements wouldn't be helpful for peace. He's also asserted to Europe's top foreign policy official that the United States will fully carry out the Iran nuclear agreement. That's one that had especially troubled me. And further, Richie, he's rejected Elliott Abrams as Secretary of State for Rex Tillerson, a very good sign because Elliott Abrams is as virulent a neocon as they come.
And yet, Jim, he's not just the cabinet, but in terms of associates and advisors, he's surrounded himself with, we can say Rothschild Zionists. He surrounded himself with neocons. And bankers, I mean, at this count, 13 former employees of Goldman Sachs, even employees of Rothschild Banking, have been carefully placed around him or by his advisors. To me, it seems like checkmate, Jim. You know, and I said this, first of all, I got it wrong. I was convinced the establishment was going to throw it for Clinton because I believed that she was their choice to escalate things in Syria, to maybe advance a ground war in that country. I really did believe that, no doubt about it. But I was wrong. And then, not because I'm childish or immature, I started looking at it and I started thinking, well, maybe we've all been had. Maybe we've all been had, and we've been served up this guy that on the face of it, Jim, looks like he's anti-establishment and he's a bit of a maverick, but really he's just the other side of the Hillary coin. What do you think?
Well, the ferocity with which the establishment is attacking him on all kinds of grounds, some of which are completely absurd, like the so-called Russian dossier, which was actually a fabrication. It was fan fiction for 4chan that was made up and sent to an anti-Trump pundit by the name of Rick Wilson, who thought it was real and sent it on to the CIA, which they treated seriously, unbelievably. He's being attacked for complaining that there appear to have been millions of illegal votes, but in fact, the evidence supports him because Jerry Brown introduced a new motor voter law in 2015. That sounds great. You're automatically registered to vote when you get your driver's license. But in California, illegal immigrants are allowed to get driver's licenses. Obama did an interview with a Latino host and anchor who was concerned about Latinos voting. that they might have their documents checked, and Obama went ahead and assured her not true. And the reason is, first of all, when you vote, you are a citizen yourself, and there's no situation where the voting rolls somehow are transferred over and people start investigating. The sanctity of the vote is strictly confidential, where Obama was encouraging Latinos to vote even if they weren't citizens by equivocating on the word citizen. In the Michigan recount, Richie, it turned out there was massive voter fraud by Hillary Clinton. Precincts that voted 95% for Hillary were found to have vast numbers of ballots added after the polls closed. I'll tell you, I did an interview with Richard Charnon, who's a brilliant statistician and an expert on elections and the theft of elections using electronic voting.
We've lost Jim momentarily there. He just dropped out. I don't know why that is. It's exactly 9.5 minutes to the top of the hour. Let's see, can we get him back on? Go to moonrockbooks.com, by the way. That's moonrockbooks.com. That's where you'll find Jim's books and much more about Jim besides as well. Let's see if we can get him back on the old dog and bone. Bit of a strange one. It sounded like, the way he just dropped out there, it sounded like there might have been a power cut. But he's back. He's back in the room. Jim, we lost you momentarily there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I know, Richie. I haven't. I don't know this happens when I'm being interviewed. Listen, he's so expert. He predicted exactly the electoral vote for Obama in 2008, for Obama in 2012, for Trump in 2016, and he studied the situation carefully and found the election was rigged, but it was rigged for Hillary.
Yeah.
And that at least 7 states had actually been won by Trump that were given to Hillary, including New Hampshire, Colorado, and Nevada. But he does have a lot of these bankers and so forth. As he sometimes expressed, would you rather people who were unsuccessful be in the cabinet? I think it's yet to see how it's going to fall out regarding some of these issues. But I will tell you what's troubling me right now, Richie, even as we speak, is that ships from 4 NATO nations are conducting naval drills in the Black Sea.
Yes.
We have helicopters, military choppers being delivered to Germany as part of a vast buildup. We have Bibi Netanyahu coming to meet with Trump, and he's expressing what appears to be great enthusiasm. We have the very bizarre action of the new head of the CIA going to Saudi Arabia and presenting them with an award for their anti-terrorism efforts when Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are the 3 greatest terrorist states in the world. That all troubles me, Richie.
Let me just put this to you now. We've known each other for, it's fair to say, years now. And I love you, by the way, and you made your name by uncovering very complex conspiracies, by dismantling them. And I'm going to put a scenario to you now, and you can jump in and interrupt me if you want, but I'm going to put a scenario to you. You'll know from speaking to me over the years that I believe that basically things are run by Rothschild Zionist central bankers. I believe, Jim, that guys like me were hooked in like a marlin, like a sea bass by these people. I think it's somewhere along the line they realised Hillary was toxic. Hillary was so toxic that she couldn't become president. Because no matter how much they control things, that people were not going to tolerate Hillary Clinton. So I surmise, I could be wrong, but this is what I'm beginning to believe. Because of his, nation's narcissism, and he's one of the great narcissists of all time, there's no doubt about that. I'm not saying he's stupid, I'm not saying he's educated, I don't know. I doubt he's stupid, but he's a narcissist. These people want martial law, don't they? They want division beyond anything that we can even comprehend. They want us hating one another, and they want to divide us along the lines of identity politics and other things like that. What better man than him to do that, Jim? And what better thing to do than to sell him to us? And we have to be big. And I'm not talking about you now. I'm not talking about you. But generally, we have to be bigger and admit when we've been had and think, Jesus Christ, yes, they've stitched us up. They've sold us a kipper. This guy is the guy they wanted. This is the guy who's going to divide us. And look what he's doing with every stroke of the executive order pen. He's creating massive division amongst people in society. And I just see that, now Jim, I could be wrong, it's my surmising of the situation. What do you think?
Well, I think there's some clear issues where the dividing line can be drawn. He did jettison the TPP. That's very significant. If Trump were some kind of fascist or promoter of corporations ruling the world, he would not have got rid of the TPP. He's had the CIA sever its contacts with George Soros, who is some kind of monster internationally. Those are two very good signs. If his newly declared policy of agreeing with the Iranian nuclear agreement stands fast, and it was reported in the New York Times on February 10th, that's a very positive sign, because one of the issues that had me most alarmed, Richie, was that he was seeming to continue to demonize Iran.
Yeah.
I think that's a real test case. Because Iran is a peace-loving country, hasn't attacked any other nation since 1775, was not pursuing nuclear weapons, abandoned the project in 2003. Our own intel agencies arrived at that conclusion in 2007, reaffirmed it in 2011. The sanctions are violations of Article 33 of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 as forms of collective punishment. They technically qualify as war crimes. So it was his apparent that
we just lost Jim again there. I think he might have connectivity issues. I'm not sure that there's any interference going on there. It's exactly 15 minutes past the hour. When we do get him back on, I want to get him talking, just to get away from Trump just for a minute, talking about the 20th century history of Iran, the UK, the CIA, BP, of course, because people don't know this stuff. Jim, there might just be a rational explanation for you dropping out. There might just be a momentary connectivity issue there. But you're back in the room anyway. I'm glad about that. That being said, we've had these issues before. Do you know what, Jim? While you're on Iran, it has occurred to me, when you dropped out there, it occurred to me, we talk to people all the time and we assume knowledge. A lot of our listeners won't know what happened to Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. They won't understand all of that. Do you want to give the Cliff Notes version of our relationship with Iran in the 20th century? Nobody better than you to do that.
Absolutely, Richie. That's wonderful, because in 1979, Americans first learned of Iran through the hostage crisis, because during the popular uprising to restore the Islamic Republic of Iran, they took 44 hostages at the embassy. Ronald Reagan's campaign manager very cleverly arranged with the Iranians not to release them before the election. That was William Casey, in order to ensure that Jimmy Carter would be defeated. No doubt, had they been released, he would have been reelected. But the fact is, most Americans think that it began with an Iranian initiative of aggression toward the United States, when nothing could be further from the truth, because as you're observing, in 1953, Kermit Roosevelt, who was a cousin of Teddy, on behalf of the CIA and representatives of MI6 in the UK, undertook a coup in Iran. It was the first successful coup by the CIA, of which they've subsequently engineered more than 80 in addition, where they took out the democratically elected government of Iran and installed the Shah, a tyrannical, despotic leader who introduced a reign of terror that was only, finally ended with the popular uprising in 1979. So, Richie, you're spot on. Most Americans don't know the history.
This. Jim, can I just let me just jump in there? Remind our listeners, what do we know about life under Mohammad Mossadegh? What was life like for people in Tehran, in Iran, around about that time? What was going on there? Because people don't know this stuff, not because they're stupid, but because they ain't taught about this in high school history. They're just not. What was life like under Mossadegh, Jim?
Well, he was a bona fide, genuine Democrat, and like a Muammar Gaddafi, he believed in benefiting the people. Gaddafi, for example, was a spectacular success with national health care, national public education, national warehouses stocked with food, If you have a medical problem in Libya, he would fly you and a friend or relative anywhere in the world, all expense paid by the government. But he was targeted because he introduced the gold dinar and the great waterworks project that would have turned North Africa into a veritable oasis. Mossadegh was a true leader and humanitarian, and it's one of the great tragedies for which America is responsible, that he was taken out.
And of course, the reason you're an educated man, Jim. I mean, you're an extremely well-educated man. The reason we don't talk about these things, I mean, I studied history at high school level. You know what's tragic, Jim? History in the Republic of Ireland, history in the UK and in the United States is taught the same way. We're taught about world wars and we're taught about kings and queens, right? That's what they teach us. I had to find out about Mohammed Mossadegh doing extracurricular studies at third level in university. Nobody was ever going to tell me, oh yes, British Petroleum, well, as they are now, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company at the time, along with the CIA and other interests, deposed a democratically elected man, and as you described, Jim, imposed a tyrant. Nobody was teaching me that. You see, this is one of the fundamental problems guys like you and the great men and women who come on this program have. How do you defeat that, Jim? That bullshit that kids are taught in high school, in primary school, in grade school. How do you overcome that?
Well, you have to place a lot of emphasis on education, on history. Unfortunately, the American people are shortchanged in terms of public education, especially in states like Wisconsin, which used to have an absolutely distinguished public high school system. But, you know, you're absolutely right, Richie, that much, much more attention has to be given to international history. Americans don't even know their own history. So it turns out to be, you know, a real stretch to think they would understand enough about the history of Iran. It's simply something that we have to assume the obligation to teach more about the developments of different nations, economies, and political systems worldwide.
Folks, go to moonrockbooks.com. That's where you'll find Jim's books and more about Jim as well. Jim Fetzer is on the line, a terrific academic. We learned about Jim back a couple of years after September the 11th. Jim was the first, there's no doubt about it, Jim was the first researcher to go on national television in the United States and debate into the lion's den on Fox News, talking about the truth about what happened on 9/11. Some of those interviews are still on YouTube. Jim's going toe-to-toe with Sean Hannity. Fantastic stuff. You know what, Jim, if I'm still, and hopefully we won't be still talking about these issues in 20 years' time, hopefully, you know, we'll have taken control of our lives back, we'll have taken control of our countries back. But when we look back on all of that, I'll always look back to that interview you did with Sean Hannity. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It's an absolute example of how to deal with a hostile, hateful interviewer. Just telling the truth, just keeping calm. Wonderful stuff. What are your memories of that, interestingly enough?
Well, there were actually two on Hannity and Combs. The first was in June of 2006, as I was about to give the keynote address at the American Scholars Conference held in Los Angeles, which was sponsored and moderated by Alex Jones. But he reached out to me to give the keynote address, and then four members of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, which I had founded in December of 2005, participated in the panel discussion that included Steve Jones, a physicist from BYU, whom I'd invited to be my co-chair, Bob Bauman, a Korean War ace who had a PhD in nuclear engineering and had been the technical advisor on the Star Wars programs for two presidents, Webster Tarpley, who was very knowledgeable about covert affairs, and myself. Right before the conference began, I was invited to come on Fox, and I was called on the way to the conference center that Ollie North would be sitting in for him. And I called my wife and said, honey, I said, it's going to be very different. It's not going to be adversarial. It's going to be two former Marine Corps officers having a conversation. And she said, don't kid yourself, Jim. They're going to try to kill you. And of course, she was completely right. Richie, I was in the waiting room and had a TV brought in because they told me they wanted to learn what scholars had discovered. And when I had the TV turned on, I saw the promo where Alan Colmes was saying, "You won't believe what your children are being taught by their professors." And I knew I had them, Richie, because they didn't know enough about me. They thought that I had a course on 9/11, which was untrue. And because Alan Colmes began the conversation by asking whether this was a required course, I explained I didn't have a course. That what I had done was founded an organization to conduct research, but I thought it was a great idea because there was so much material for a course. And we went from there. I said I hope they that they usually didn't have their facts Fox like this, FACTS FOXED, introducing a new phrase I thought might have some currency, because they so often get things wrong. But in that instance, I was able to take control. And even when Ollie North came on, and he said, didn't you tell our producer that you have a course on this? And I said, no. I explained to him that I don't have such a course, but that I thought it was a great idea. And he went on to ask, how many members were in the organization. And already we had 300 or 500 at that point. It would grow to 800. That took some wind out of his sail, and he asked Colmes actually asked me, "Do we have any evidence that anyone in the administration, such as Dick Cheney, had been involved in 9/11?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I proceeded to tell him the story of the Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, being in the underground bunker, where an aide came up to Cheney and said, "Sir, it's 50 miles out. Sir, it's 30 miles out. Sir, do the orders still stand?" And Cheney whipped his head around and said, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" Mineta didn't know it, but the order was a stand-down order,
That's
not
right.
to shoot down a plane that was approaching the Pentagon, Richie.
That's right.
It would have,
yeah.
Jim. It was fairly sensational, because if the obvious thing to do under the circumstances was to shoot down the plane, you lose the plane and the passengers, but you save the personnel and the property. In fact, this plane actually flew toward the Pentagon and then swerved over it at the last minute as an explosion went off there, apparently fired by a missile into the building. But that plane did not hit the building itself. It was a decoy.
I'll never forget the look on Alan Colmes' face, because he looked like he wanted to murder his producer. I mean, and I've been, a commercial radio producer, presenting a fast-paced, hard-hitting news program in the morning. So I know what it's like, and it was fantastic stuff. And I'd read David's book about 9/11, the Alice in Wonderland book, which is an incredible read, and I was getting into it at that stage. And I saw your interview, I looked you up, and it was only a couple of years later then that you first came on to speak with me when I was presenting for TRE in Spain. And it really is vital.
You're absolutely right, though, Richie. They had me back a couple of months later when Sean Hannity was there. And to my astonishment, I was able to take control of that, too. I also got the Norman Mineta story out, and other indications that the destruction of the World Trade Center could not possibly have been done by planes having hit the Twin Towers.
That's right, Jim. Jim Fetzer's on the line, 27 minutes past the hour. Now, back to Trump-type stuff. I was speaking with your old friend and sparring partner, Kevin Barrett, the other day. And we were talking about you, so your ears must have been burning. We were talking about you on air, but of course we were saying nice things, because both of us hold you in the highest regard. Gentlemen can disagree from time to time, but gentlemen will never fall out over it. And we were having a chat, and I said, I wonder, is old Fetzer, not so much of the old, please. I said, I wonder, is Jim, is he, because of his background, military background, worked in academia, is Jim... Now, this doesn't mean you're wrong, Jim. You might be right. I mean, this is just my opinion. But is Jim still always going to hold on to the idea that we can find the right man or woman to put in the Oval Office who will give us back what we haven't had for, forever and a day? Or is Jim coming around to thinking like me? Now, again, it doesn't mean I'm right, Jim. It's just my opinion that we can never, ever vote our way out of this. We can't, because it's always stacked against us. We don't choose the candidates. The elite hand us the candidates and say, pick between these two people. Is that a fair thing to ask you? Do you question yourself about this, Jim, about democracy and about whether or not we should be voting? I'm going a long way to ask a simple question. Go ahead.
Well, it's a matter of choices. Once Bernie was sabotaged by the DNC, where they stole at least 13 states, that would have given Bernie the nomination, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence substantiating this. Once Hillary secured the nomination, she was an unacceptable candidate on virtually any ground. She brought about the disaster in Libya, the slaughter of Libya, in order to promote the Rothschild banking interests and France's interest in preserving Africa as a neo-colonial preserve. She was instrumental in getting weapons to the rebels in Benghazi and the death of Chris Stevens, who had sought to stop the transfer of Stinger missiles to the rebels in fear that they'd be used to shoot down civilian planes. She was responsible for the death of Gaddafi himself, who was not putting up a fight, but surrendering to a location she had designated. But she had the convoy, which was traveling under a white flag of surrender, interdicted, and Gaddafi brutally murdered, castrated, and sodomized with a bayonet. Through the Clinton Foundation, she was doing pay for play, where they were getting massive contributions, such as $75 million from Australia, in return for Hillary providing strong State Department support for the TPP, which the Australians thought would be a great boon, because Hillary's no longer in the position to provide those favors for pay.
No.
The Clinton Foundation is folding its door. The Clinton Global Initiative is laying off its workers, and it looks to me as though Trump will crack down. He's already told Kurt Gowdy and Jason Shevitz to pursue her on every avenue that is possible. In other words, he's unleashed them to go after the Clinton Foundation and Hillary. Donald was an imperfect and flawed candidate, but he had tremendous promise. And what was persuasive to me, Richie, was his desire to end the wars in the Middle East, his opposition to the TPP, and to get a handle on our immigration situation. And in fact, it appears to me he's doing those as long as, what troubled me to give second thoughts was this demonization of Iran, and now the buildup in Europe. I'm hopeful that nothing bad is going to come of this.
Yeah, not to rehash old arguments, but the migrant thing, you see, this really bothers me, and we've really attacked is probably a strong word, but we've used a lot of audio and video from InfoWars to ask questions about the independent media in the United States, which appears to have gone 180 degrees on the causes of the migrant crisis. Jim, you and I have been talking for years about false flag operations. We've been talking for years about coups. What we've seen in Syria is undoubtedly, thus far has been a failed coup to remove Bashar al-Assad, who was the head of a peaceful, upwardly mobile, reforming country until 2009, 2010. And we know this. We know who was really behind the arming and the funding of Islamic State. Now, this is where I argue all the time about Trump. Trump knows this. So by saying we're going to shut down anybody coming into our country for any reason from these 7 countries, he's wrong on 2 counts. One, yes, I know that the CIA Mossad policies, they actually do release genuine terrorists. I know this. It's not always false flags. You do have genuine terrorists amongst the migrant flow. I wouldn't say many, but you do have genuine, right? So there's no doubt about that. But by doing that, what Trump has done is he set the American people on 2 sides again, screaming at one another. He's put ethnic minorities in the United States, definitely he's made them nervous. Whether he's put them in a very vulnerable position in terms of their safety, their personal safety, I don't know, but it might be argued that. And all that's getting forgotten all the time, Jim, is if there is genuine terrorism, if there is a massive migrant flow across Europe, which there is, it's been brought about by the terrorist policies of our intelligence agencies, the Mossad, MI5, MI6, and the CIA. And this is getting lost. And all these people who talked about Trump before he got elected, and I'm not talking about you, but all these people who said, oh, he'll reinvestigate 9/11, oh, he'll go after vaccines, and more importantly, oh, he'll tell the truth about ISIS. He hasn't done that. He's perpetuated the myth that these countries are dangerous. These countries are lunatics, therefore we must protect ourselves from them, when in fact, Jim, these countries would be doing quite all right if we hadn't bloody well destroyed them. What do you say?
Well, I agree with the major premise here that all the disruption in the Middle East, basically turning it into chaos and rubble, is a consequence of American intervention because of the fabricated events of 9/11. I mean, that was orchestrated. It was brought to us compliments of the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. It appears to have originated in the fertile imagination of Bibi Netanyahu, who wanted to figure out a way to get the United States to take out the modern Arab countries that served as a counterbalance to Israel's domination of the region, and to promote the expansion of Israel to the greater Israel, dominating from the Tigris, Euphrates to the Nile. So I agree with that completely. But Donald has also opposed very much ISIS. It appears that he is actually having U.S. planes coordinate with Russians and taking out ISIS, which was I agree, and I have researched and talked about this widely, made in the USA. ISIS was created in 2012 by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Hillary was Secretary of State. Obama was president. After the failure of the gas attack that was blamed on Assad, but actually happened because of weapons provided to the rebels, either by Prince Bandar or by Hillary Clinton from the Libyan stockpile, when the Russians produced a 50-page dossier that showed that the Syrian government was not responsible. When they came to the aid of the Syrians, that's when the tide began to turn, because as Wesley Clark explained, Richie, as you well know, there was a plan to take out 7 countries in the next 5 years, beginning with Iraq and Libya, ending with Syria and Iran. It hasn't played out that way thanks to Russian intervention. I do believe that Donald will pursue the destruction of ISIS, which is a very good thing because it's become a completely terror organization, even with funding from the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, support from Israel and so forth. Very bad. I think Trump just hasn't quite got deeply enough into government. His knowledge is not quite sufficiently detailed for him to do the things that need to be done. But I'm still persuaded he intends to take out ISIS and is going to, contribute to this salvation of Syria. 2
things, Jim, there. Somebody both of us admire, you and I admire equally, is a woman called Cynthia McKinney, who's been on with me dozens of times over the years. And Cynthia, she's been on quite a bit in the last year, but about a year and a half ago, she spent about 40 minutes explaining AIPAC to me, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and it was incredible. And what she was saying was, really, at the time, even though she's changed her tune a bit as well, and she supported Trump at the very end, before the election, is that it doesn't matter a damn really which man or woman gets in, even if that man or woman is independent and hasn't been gotten to by AIPAC. The fact is, the House of Representatives and the Senate have been. And no matter what any semi-decent man, you mentioned Sanders earlier on, and a lot of our listeners liked Bernie Sanders. And nobody could argue with you, Jim, when you talked about Sanders being screwed royally by the Clintons. There's no doubt about that. It happened and nobody could argue with you. But I would argue again and again and again, Sanders getting in, he wouldn't have been able to do anything. The office and the executive is set up the way it's set up. It's set up so that it can be controlled by external forces, irrespective of who's wearing the crown. And this is the problem I have. And with Trump, you have to look at Netanyahu. You mentioned Bibi, who's one of the most evil men under the sun. Look at the closeness of the relationship between the two of them going back several years. And this is
I'm very
serious, right?
troubled by that, and I'm a huge fan of Cynthia McKinney, who years ago revealed that when new congressmen come to Washington, D.C., they're asked to sign a pledge to put the interests of Israel ahead of those of the United States, and those who don't, Richie, find themselves confronted by a well-financed alternative candidate.
Spot on.
So I'm troubled about that. You know, you mentioned about Trump and 9/11. Thierry Masson, who's one of the world's leading public intellectuals who edits VoltaireNet.org, has written about Trump that he was the first personality in the world to contest the official version of the attacks of 9/11 on television that very day. After having noted the engineers who built the Twin Towers were now working for him, he declared on New York's Channel 10 that it was impossible that Boeing's could have burst through the steel structures of the towers. He continued by stating it was also impossible that Boeing's could have caused the towers to collapse. He concluded by affirming that there had to be other factors of which we were as yet unaware. I mean, that was an admirable statement then, and it gives me reason to believe that he will, in fact, address the issues of 9/11 and the catastrophic consequences they've led to for the Middle East.
Jim, you're absolutely right. And I interviewed Susan Lindauer, and I wasn't aware that Trump had said exactly what you just attributed to him. But he did, and Susan sent me the clip, and you're absolutely right. But again, and you're going to think I'm just being a cantankerous old Irish guy now. But again, what I'm going to suggest is Trump shoots from the hip, and he's narcissistic, and he might be bright. He's incredibly egocentric, and he will say whatever comes into his head at any time, no matter what, no matter when. And that's why so many people liked him. But I'm also thinking, Jim, if you're if you're Lynn the Rothschild or Nat Rothschild or some of these people, you look at him and you think, he's perfect for us. Because a guy like that is far more easier to manipulate. I would believe anyway than the average guy, the narcissist guy. You know, you can get a narcissist. Go ahead.
Let me say, Richie, I think the gravity of the office is sinking in. I think he's moderating his positions. I was much more concerned before he abandoned the TPP, before he directed the CIA to sever its connections with Soros, before he vetoed the appointment of Elliot Abrams as a deputy secretary of state, before he acknowledged that there really is one China and not two, before he told Bibi that more settlements are a bad idea, and before he affirmed to the European Union that the United States will fully carry out the nuclear agreement with Iran. I was much more troubled before those developments, Richie. So, a week ago, I had a higher degree of anxiety than today, but I'm still not taking anything for granted. And it's going to become very obvious very fast if we have somehow been played. I still think he's the only man in the world who could change the situation and defeat globalism as it's envisioned by the New World Order, which would have taken a giant step forward, even cementing its hold through the TPP, which would even have come at the sovereignty of the United States, Richie, because there are clauses in the TPP create an international board of attorneys, corporate attorneys, with the right to override the laws and statutes of any of the Pacific Rim nations thereby subsumed, including the Constitution of the United States. We're rid of it, and for good reason, but there is a threat that other versions could bring it back. So we are going to have to display eternal vigilance about this issue.
Now, I'm going to offer one more counter-argument to what you said, and then you're definitely going to have the last word. And when we hang up, I'm not going to editorialize, Jim. I'm not going to say a thing. You're going to get the last word on this. There's no doubt about it. Listen, years ago, I used to be a big fan of the NBA. I don't see so much of it anymore. I tried to watch a game last night. San Antonio were at the Knicks, and I was trying to watch it, but I was falling asleep on the sofa. Not because the game was bad, but I was tired. I used to love the NBA, and I remember watching an interview with Phil Jackson when he was the coach of the Bulls. The interview must have lasted 20 minutes, and Phil said, I'll never forget it. He said, you manage the superstars of your team in vastly different ways. There are guys that you give them orders and you talk to them like a drill sergeant, sergeant major. Now, you know all about that, Jim. There are guys you speak to like that, and they take it, and it's what's good for them. And then you have the mavericks. You have the mavericks, the individuals, the loud guys, the guys with the big egos. And you speak to them and you deal with them in a different way. And in fact, he said, you end up giving them a suggestion without them realising it. They think they thought of it, a la Michael Jordan, and everybody wins, everybody is happy. You said something brilliant there. TPP has gone away, but it might come in another guise. This is why I'll still believe tonight, despite your excellent arguments, and I mean the Rex, I'm not patronising you, I'll still believe tonight he was chosen for his narcissism, because there is a way of getting Trump to do what they want without him doing it. And you talked about Trump getting rid of this guy and that's good, and getting rid of that guy and that's good as well. That's because he's a maverick, Jim. That's because they're dealing with him in a different way than they would deal with Bill Clinton, who I'm sure was just told, you're doing this today, Bill. This is the end of it, and you'll do it, and you'll shut up, and Clinton will go, fair enough. With Trump, I think it's different. Now, you have as long as you want to make the final point on this, and we'll leave it for today. I won't interrupt you, and I won't editorialise. Go ahead.
Richie, I agree that Trump has personality traits that have worked very well for him in the private arena. He also, of course, had a reputation. He was well known to the public through his show, The Apprentice. He's used to firing people. Trump likes to bring in people of different mix and background and then sort things out, get rid of them, make it better. I predict he's going to remove Reince Priebus as his chief of staff because Priebus represents too much of the old guard, the establishment Republicans, even the establishment Democrats, who, by the way, both fought fiercely against Donald Trump. He's also, however, gutting the mainstream media in this country. It's absolutely astonishing how successful he's been in identifying the fake news coming from networks like CNN, which in my judgment ought just as well to be named CIA because it presents so much propaganda. MSNBC, NBC, many of the other networks, even the New York Times and the Washington Post, have become nothing but propaganda outlets opposing Trump. Nevertheless, he is making tremendous progress. The enthusiasm for the mainstream media is probably at an all-time low, and I attribute that to all the false reports they gave, falsely setting up Hillary for a victory, presenting padded polls to show she was guaranteed Trump didn't have a chance. Even Michael Moore, however, predicted that Trump would win because Hillary was ignoring the white working class in the Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's exactly how it played out, but his victory would have been even greater had not the polls have been rigged, as Richard Charnon has explained for Hillary, where he actually had won 7 more states but were given to Hillary because of the rigging. Richie, I think this man has been historically underestimated. And while I am concerned and sensitive about the issues you have raised, and frankly, I think you do a brilliant job as the host of this show, I still continue to believe that we have a ghost of a chance of making things really change for the better by way of Donald Trump. And there's no other man in the world, in my estimation, who could possibly represent that opportunity.
Jim, brilliant to chat with you. Folks, go to moonrockbooks.com to find Jim's books for a start. Read more about him. Jim, it's going to be a very interesting next few months, my friend. No doubt we'll be talking more about it. Man of my word, I will be reading our listeners' tweets, but I have no more comment on it tonight. Thanks, my friend. Look after yourself, and let's talk again real soon.
My great pleasure, Richie. Thanks so much.
Great stuff. Jim Fetzer on the line to us there from Madison, Wisconsin.